And we usually come together over, Carrie's orchestra, for instance, they're a symphony orchestra, and they usually don't have services on weekends. So their orchestra, it plays 50-50, like the orchestra I used to play at Baron, 50% opera and 50% symphony. So Saturday and Sunday are not necessarily holy days. I mean, they basically, they play opera when they have an audience. You have to play at night, and you have to play on weekends when you have an audience. So that's what they do. So basically on weekends, we'll fly up. I'll usually fly from Zurich to Cologne. Charlie picks me up. It's down to science almost. We go immediately to the Opera House in Bonn. Carrie drives 2.5 hours from Luxembourg. We rehearse very hard for 2 or 3 hours, take a lunch break, talk about business during our lunch break so we save time while we're resting our chops. Then usually have another 2 or 3 hour session, and then we go eat someplace, usually talk about business again if we need to. The next day we rehearse usually, if we have time, as hard as we can for 3 or 4 hours, and then I fly back in the evening usually, and everybody goes their separate ways.
I just have one more thing I want to say about finding concerts. And like we've been doing this for almost 20 years now. And we played in some very nice halls with some very good orchestras, some great chamber music societies. But every year, it's as if we're starting in square one. Every year, we're having to call up either the same people or new people and say we've done this, and tell them what we've done. And we still get the reaction, well, I don't know if we have the money. I don't know if a horn quartet or brass quintet would fit into our group. It's usually because it's either horn quartet or brass or winds. Strings usually have no trouble, but there are hundreds of good string groups. So it's a constant fight, and that's where the agent comes in. It would be nice to have an agent come in and do all the work for you, but unfortunately a lot of agents don't do that, like we said before, unless they're making money. So you can't think that once you establish your reputation, you're on a roll and it's just going to happen for you. Sometimes we still get calls, which is great, but we're always looking, we're always on the phone, we're always writing, and it never ends. It's a never-ending battle, basically.
You were talking about cold calling for concerts and booking gigs. How often how far in advance do you call for example, a chamber music series?
A year in advance, 1.5 to 2 years.
A year and a half to 2 years.
Minimum.
Mm-hmm. Because they usually book, they usually have finished their booking a year in advance. And they have a committee that meets usually, I would say, 18 to 20 months before.
Okay, thanks.
Another question? Are there opportunities for brass players or for American musicians still in Europe? Is it the same as it was 25 years ago?
I would say it's not. It's definitely not the same as it was, because it's like every place. It's a supply and demand system. And 20 years ago, there was a huge demand, and the supply was not there in Europe. I mean, with only Europeans playing. And so hundreds of American musicians went there. I mean, not only from America, but a lot from North America. And we were all part of the same basic migration, we can call it that. And now I would say, with the coming of probably the biggest differences with the coming of the European community, the EU, the European Union, I would say just recently, one of my students, for instance, did not get invited. She happens to be an American lady. She did not get invited to an audition in Rome. Now, at the moment, this is still relatively rare that they don't invite you if you're not in the EU. But I would guess that without any doubt, within 5 to 10 years, that will become much more commonplace, because, I mean, basically, one of the reasons to have a union is to say, okay, we have these obligations to our own people. You know, it'd be like if you, you could certainly, I don't know the people in this room, but I would say just for me, if I were an American citizen, which I am, and I were living in America somewhere, and I would be qualified, I would think I would be qualified for some job, and I would go and play for a third on position in Rochester, let's say, and that position would be free, whatever. And I found out afterwards that they had appointed a German to that position, or a Frenchman, or whatever. I would be a little irritated if I thought that at the end, there were like 8 people in the last round who were all qualified for the job. They took that guy. Without any doubt, that person might be the best player. But I think that the European community will begin to protect its own at some point.
And that's the key word, the protectionism that's come into it. I mean, certainly Holland is all but closed off to foreigners. They've got too many qualified horn players of their own they're trying to employ. They take care of their own, which I like. France has done the same way. France has been hearsay for several years that, if you're not French, you're not going to get the job. And I never particularly agreed with that assessment. But in the end, if you really sit down with these guys and talk it out with the guys on the jury, you'll find out that in the end, if it came between a non-Frenchman and a Frenchman, they naturally feel obligated to employ their own tax-paying citizens. So those two countries, and England, of course, as well, very close.
I mean, the situation in Europe is just generally changing. I mean, tacking on to exactly what they just mentioned, the idea of walking in there off the street and just playing an audition and getting a job is not very likely at this point. However, if you were to go over there as a student and study for a couple of years, I would imagine even in Holland, if you were to show that you're prepared to make the investment to become part of their community, then the way they would treat you would be very different from just some American walking in and, hey, listen to me, I'm the one for this job, which is sort of like what it was 20, 25, 30, 35 years ago. As an American, you could almost, if you had a good college degree or something, you could almost count on at least getting a chance to play at an audition. So in that sense, things really have changed.
There's work to be had in Poland, but you have to learn Polish. That seems a bit too daunting to me. In the Czech Republic too, actually.
I would say that if you can put it in categories. I would say basically it's like anything. A person who's in the category 1, or is the people that are most sought after for the jobs, would certainly be someone doing that same position in another orchestra. Obviously, already has experience and from that country. If category 2 would be somebody that already has a job. I would think they would take that person. Many times they will invite that person to the audition, whether they are of that country or not, over a person that has no job that is from that country. That still is that way, I think. But where it comes down to the fight comes down to when you're talking about, for the students that have no job. And a student that has no job, for instance, that would apply for a German orchestra. Now I did that, but that was a long time ago. But okay. But nowadays, a student that would apply for a job and has an American address, for instance, or has a Canadian address, or has a Puerto Rican address, whatever his name, somewhere not in Europe, and apply to the job, they have almost no chance of being invited to an audition. You need to have an invitation to come to auditions in Europe. Now, a student that is, whereas my class is in Lugano, is very diverse. I have 4 out of 14. Only 4 of them are Swiss, for instance. The rest are. I have 2 American girls and a Chinese guy and a Polish guy and an Austrian fellow, and from everywhere. But basically, those people they have. With no job and not being from Switzerland, for instance, if you're talking about Switzerland, they have less of a chance to get invited than somebody from almost anywhere that has a job. That's the catch-22 situation, unfortunately. But if they're living there and they don't have a job, it catapults them already into the next higher category than if they're applying from here. If you're there and you have a work permit, because that's the biggest issue. They want to see that you have a work permit, a living permit. If you have those things, then you're not an illegal alien. You can take the audition without any real skin off their nose, so to speak.
But where have you placed your students these days? In which countries have you placed your students?
Well, I have students in Portugal. I have students in Italy. I have students in Germany. I have students in Switzerland, obviously. I have students one in Austria, Denmark.
So you're placing your students all over Europe.
And only one of those persons, those students, that's important, only one of those students is actually from that country.
Yeah. Guys, I think we're going to have to call things to a halt here so you can get some food because they're going to close down.
Oh, thank you.
So let's thanks to American Horn Quartet.